Alright, so today we're just going to be working on some basic geometric forms, and our focus is going to be on shading them, okay? So, I've got right here my drawing pencil. So this is a little softer than normal, so it's easier to go a little darker. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. So this is kind of my value scale here, alright? So I'm going to go to second to darkest here. I'm going to take the side of my pencil. I'm going to push down with a fair amount of pressure. Might not be the absolute most pressure that I am capable of applying, but it's a reasonably hard amount of pressure, okay? And then down here, in this last one, I'm going to roll up onto the tip of my pencil a little bit. So I'm going to go from being on the side like this, rolling up on the tip. And then I'm going to apply a similar amount of pressure, but because the surface area is much smaller, it's going to go on much darker. Here I'm going to just lighten up a little bit, kind of a medium pressure. And here I'm going to do a light pressure. Okay, so a lot of the portraits I was seeing have big, bold contour outlines on the face and features and very little kind of shading happening in the image. So we really want to practice that shading and having at least 5 distinct tones. Now, it's really easy to get 5 tones, so you should be able to get a wider range than that. You should be able to get 8. You should be able to get maybe 10 without too much trouble. But 5 is kind of the minimum that you need. You can pull most stuff off with just 5. So, yeah, that's what we're aiming for today. So let's start by blocking in or laying in our shapes here. So we're going to start with this horizon line. I want to sight where the horizon line's at, so I'm going to hold out my pencil like this. I'm holding it in front of the image. I'm not just holding it out randomly. So that's 1. And it looks like we've got like 1 unit in this lower half and about 1.5 in the upper half. So it's a little more than a third up. I'm going to say it's about here. So I like to use the side of my pencil to sketch this out, and I like to use kind of an extended grip like this. And what this does is it lays in really fine lines for me. If I use my pointy pencil, surface of the paper is like this, and the pencil point is going to dig a groove in there. It's going to fill that groove with graphite, which is going to make a line. But then when I erase, it's going to be hard to get the graphite out of that little trench I dug. If I just brush the graphite onto the surface of the paper, it's going to be way easier to erase. So especially for this kind of lay-in process, it's really nice to really nice to use the side of my pencil and just kind of brush it on. Okay? I'm not scratching my drawing into the paper. I'm just laying my drawing on top of the paper. So now I want to figure out what's about halfway. So I'm going to try to sight about halfway on my image. Alright, so at about the halfway point on the horizon, I have the slope of that cone, that lower cone. I guess there's only 1 cone. So I'm going to try to figure out where halfway is on the paper. So it's about here. So at about the halfway point here, that lower cone intersects with my horizon line. I'm going to sight the angle, so I'm holding it out and matching the angle of the cone there. About right, initially. Now I'm going to use that cone as sort of my standard unit. So what I mean by that is I'm going to use that cone and different parts of it to kind of measure everything else. So I'm going to figure out how big everything else needs to be compared to that cone. Now, usually for a standard unit, we want something that's relatively small, but not too tiny. If you think about like, if our paper's like 12 inches by 9 inches, we want something that's going to be about like an inch on the paper, something like that. This is a little big, but that's okay for what we're doing. When you're doing portraits, you typically use like an eye as the standard unit because it's about the right size for measuring most of the stuff. So that just goes up a little bit over the horizon and then kind of heads back down. So I'm going to sight the other angle there. So the other angle says it's like this. I'm going to need to adjust the bottom of that, but that's okay. I'll lay this one in. I'm going to redo the bottom here. That looks better anyway. So again, I'm just kind of brushing the paper. So we're going to start by laying in everything together. And then we're going to shade maybe a couple forms, and then we're going to lay some color on them. We're going to use the watercolors today, and eventually we're going to transition to the acrylics because it's the same sort of process, but it's easier to see what's going on with the watercolors. Alright, so there's our first shape here. That curve actually seems a little steeper. So one of the things that we talk about in Art 1 is as this object moves away from the horizon line here, this curve down here is going to get more and more rounded, steeper. I'm going to soften that up a little bit. All right, so now I'm going to move over and maybe work on that cylinder. Okay, so thinking the cylinder kind of comes up from right about here. So you can see that some of the cylinder overlaps the horizon line from behind the cone, so we'll kind of mark that. And the top's going to be about here, something like that. And then the other side is going to be, I'd say probably about here. So we'll bring that line up as well. Mark in the cylinder. Okay, so this is kind of viewed from above. So even though this cylinder is above the horizon line, the viewpoint of the viewer is kind of higher than that, so we're able to see the top still. All right. And then bottoms maybe around here. I went a little too low. And try your best to get these proportional and placed correctly. That's not necessarily the most important thing for this exercise specifically, but it's always good to practice, right? Always good to practice doing things right. I'm trying to use my big eraser more so I don't wear out all the erasers on my pencils. Next we have a sphere. So the cross section of the sphere for the lay-in is always going to be circular. So I'm going to look at kind of the gap between my horizon line here and the top of the sphere. Try to use that for positioning. I'm going to think about where the bottom is. It's about right here. So hopefully that gives me a reasonable size. Already starting to feel like it's a little squished, so maybe I want to bring it down. And I feel like if I want to be accurate, when I bring this down, I need to bring this down. Alright, so I know that some of you are probably saying, Mr. Richards, I don't want to draw basic forms. I want to draw fantasy weapons or whatever. That was just a funny example. Nothing wrong with it. No judgment in this classroom. But understanding how these basic forms work and how they interact with the light is going to be really important for your imaginative drawing, but also for your observational drawing. If you kind of understand what more organic forms are similar to, you'll understand how they interact with the light, and you'll be able to make informed decisions about that. And sometimes it's difficult to see what's going on in something you're looking at, but if you have a little understanding of how that basic form interacts with the light, you're going to be much better off than if you don't. All right. So next we have our cube. I think I don't want to tamper with it too much. So the top edge of this cube overlaps the horizon line. So I can sight these angles if I want to. Something like that. And then the top edge is kind of above the sphere here. I'm going to look at this negative space that's between, or it's not really negative space, this space of the cube, this right-hand side that is between the edge of the cube and the sphere. I'm going to try to use that a little bit. Already starting to have a little trouble putting these pieces together. That's okay though. The nice thing also about practicing with abstract shapes is we have to get our brain, when we're drawing a portrait, especially, or anything we recognize, to process the shapes that make that thing up. We can't be thinking about what we're drawing. We have to be thinking about what shapes make that thing up. So practicing on abstract shapes gets us into that mode of thinking because we're just using shapes, right? And it also informs us how to get there. So we'll hopefully be used to being in this mode of thinking and be able to recognize it when it happens when we're drawing recognizable things. All right, so our next one is going to come up like this. So I can see like some mistakes that I'm making, and if I was doing like a portrait, or if I was doing like any kind of piece of artwork that I was going to be spending some hours on, and it was important that it looks correct, I would correct those. I would spend a lot of time in this lay-in phase trying to get that as correct as humanly possible, because it sucks when you spend hours and hours working on top of your lay-in, and you realize that something is wrong, and you have to redo it. So it's always more time effective to fix things in this stage than later. So I would really focus on that. But for what we're doing today, it's not super important that everything be perfect. So while I would encourage you to try your best to get this lay-in as accurate as possible, it's not really important in the long run how realistic and accurate it is. It's good practice, but it's not key to the product here. This goes back a little bit more. All right. And then the bottom of the pyramid's like right here. So I'm going to shoot for that. I'm going to sight the angle. I'm going to sight the angle again. So when I sight the angle, I'm holding my pencil out at the angle that I'm trying to replicate. So I hold it at the same angle, then I move it to the paper, trying to keep it at that angle, and then I draw a line where I had it. Let's see how tall that. I can do the same thing for measuring distances. I just kind of mark it with my thumb, and I can compare it to something else. So that pyramid is about as tall as the cone. So that's going to be pretty much at the top of my paper here. So maybe compositionally I should have done this a little smaller. That's all right though. This intersects a little above this corner. Just want this corner to stick out a little bit. And this to go over. This has a very slight angle to it. All right. Bam. Okay. So now I can erase things out if I need to. Stuff that's being overlapped now. A lot of times I can get away with not erasing it if it's going to be toned later. If it's going to be really light, I need to erase it, but otherwise, most of the time I don't really have to worry too much. Alright, so there's our basic forms. So hopefully you got those laid in fairly well. If not, if you're having trouble with the lay-in, you need to practice the lay-in. It's really important that we get competent at each step. And we can move forward today and keep doing stuff, and that's fine. But if we're not able to get the lay-in, eventually it's gonna cause problems every time we do this. So if we look at our value scale here, we have 5 values, right? So typically each one should be at about 20%. So I think a good way to think about this is this level of whiteness here is our highest value, all right? So that is like most intense white sheet of paper value, all right? If I'm drawing outside, that's the value of the sun. So most things should have a little bit of tone to them. If you actually look at your reference image here, there's not a lot of areas that are totally white. We can see a small area to the left on the ground that is as white as it gets. But if we look at the forms themselves, they have a little bit of tone on them. So we want to treat everything we draw the same way. There wants to be a little bit of tone. We don't want everything to be super intense. So we really don't want to have a lot of white paper most of the time. So that's something we want to keep in mind as we're working on these. Let's see. So let's get into it. Let's kind of divide everything into 2 tones. So we're going to try to use the same steps we've seen in the Proco videos. So now what we have to do is kind of look at everything and decide what's shadow and what isn't. So I'm going to start with this. These flat forms, like these rectangular forms, are nice because we have flat shadows usually. So this whole surface is going to be a single tone. This whole surface is going to be a single tone. On the spheres and the cones and cylinders, we have gradients. But for now, we're just kind of knocking everything in a shadow. So you can see on the sphere here on the right-hand side, we've got some reflected light. There's light that's coming from over here. It's hitting the cone. It's bouncing off onto the sphere. So on the right-hand side of the sphere, we actually have some reflected light. So let's kind of preserve that for now. So that's going to kind of go like this, that shadow shape. Actually, I might erase some of that out because I've got some extra lines there I don't need. All right, so then we've got a cast shadow. So this sphere is casting a shadow. Spheres are always going to have a little bit of shadow underneath them. And that cast shadow shape is going to come like this. So I'm going to block that in. And then it's going to go up here, like this. Come down here. So I'm going to block that in. Again, all of this should be the same value. You probably go with like a middle tone. This is maybe more of a light middle, but that's okay. Kind of a middle or light middle. We're just kind of marking where the shadows are going to be, and then we'll adjust them later. Also got a little bit of cast shadow right here. And I'm going to actually like crisp up this line a little bit so I can see where the edge of my cube is. But then I'm just going to add a little pinch of cast shadow right there. Now up here, we have kind of a C-shaped shadow. And then we have a light spot right there. And then We have a shadow kind of running down here. You can see one of the other nice things about using the side of my pencil is I don't have strong contour lines to my shapes. A lot of these contour lines are eaten up by my shading. And if I'm trying to draw realistically, I don't really usually want to have a lot of dark contour lines because things in life don't have sharp contour lines. There's not like a dark line markered around my chin. There's not a dark outline to my nose. They're all soft and subtle kind of curves. Now, every once in a while, there will be a dark shadow shape that's really skinny and looks like a line, but that's pretty rare. If I think about like my eyelids and my eyelashes, that's pretty close to being a line, but it's really more of a long, skinny shape. So I don't want to have dark contour lines around everything. This is a shadow up here. And I might think while I'm shading about shaping the object. So I might think about which direction my strokes go. So my strokes have to go some direction. So for this pyramid, for example, I might as well make them match the angle of the base here. And that sort of gives it a little bit of form definition. For the cone, I might as well kind of curve my strokes a little bit to define the form a little bit. Got shadow here. And we got some shadow up here. And we've got a cast shadow going to here. And again, I might sharpen up, crisp up these lines a little bit, just so I can still see them as I shade. Cast shadow coming up this way, and then going to there. There's a little bit of cast shadow back here as well. Alright, so now I've got my two tones laid in. Alright, so next we're going to do two forms, and then I'm going to demonstrate how to lay in color on them, and then we can go async and do the rest. So now I'm going to look at my cube here and my sphere, and I'm going to try to adjust. So I might go a little bit darker on my cube, but I think I'm pretty close there. While I'm at it, I'm going to try to figure out how to get rid of the contour lines that are here. So I've got the thing that kind of defines this edge is my background is a little bit darker than the cube, so I might shade that a little bit. Kind of get rid of those contour lines. And that shadow comes down to about here. And then we've got a lot of highlight in this area. So here, I'm probably going to leave a contour line, but I'm going to soften it up, make it nice and subtle. Alright, this is pretty light, so I might put a little bit of tone on it, but not much. That's probably like halfway between medium light and light. And this is a little bit darker. Put a little more tone on it. That looks pretty good. There's a little bit of extra shadow right here, you can see. I'm going to add that. And then there's a little, it gets a little darker down here in this cast shadow. Kind of up through here. So I'll add that. Now my sphere here, the highlight gets pretty close to white, but I want to get more of a gradient, so I'm going to leave that highlight. And I'm going to get a little darker on the rest of it. So that really dark spot kind of curves around this way a little bit. Kind of like that. And then I want I'll gradually ease my way up. I'm actually going to switch to my drawing pencil now and go a little darker. So I also might want to kind of calibrate my tonal range to the tools I have. So my darkest spot is going to be as dark as I can get with this drawing pencil. So I might also make that the darkest thing in the drawing. So I might think about where the darkest spot in the drawing is, maybe like right here at the base of this pyramid, and make that kind of that tone, because that's the darkest I can get. So everything else should be adjusted according to that. And so this shading actually doesn't get super light, just gets a little bit lighter. So it's something like that. And then the cast shadow, I'm going to add as well because it kind of defines that edge. It's a little bit darker here. All right, so now we're going to go in with a little bit of watercolor and do these two shapes, just so I don't. Normally I'd shade the whole thing, but I don't want to necessarily keep you during async time, so I'm going to show you how to paint these shapes. So we can paint these shapes any color we want. We're going to use watercolor today. So I'm going to start by making the square green. All right. Let me see my watercolors. Let's scoot those over a little bit. Actually, here. So I'm probably going to want to do like a warm side for my watercolors and a cool side, and then maybe kind of a middle muddy side over here. I'm going to put my green over on this cool side. I probably want to do my lightest area first, so I'm going to add some water and make a light wash. And I'm going to get this. So say I lay this down, I decide it's not light enough to be my highlight area. I'm going to add a little more water. I can kind of move the pigment around a little bit more. If I still have too much pigment on there, I can take a paper towel. I need a clean paper towel. This is not clean, but it's dry. There's nothing wet on it. I can dab, and that'll take off a little bit of pigment. So that's always handy to have around. It's really good for cleaning your brushes, but it's also really good for dabbing paint off if necessary. All right. So I want to glaze this so that I can still see the tones underneath, but I also apply some color. All right, so this top area here is kind of more of a middle tone. So for that, I probably want a little more paint. I'm probably going to want to go more saturated here. So I'm using the tone of the graphite underneath to show through and demonstrate some of the value in the form, but I'm also using it to guide how I apply my paint. So this is a little different than the way we paint with acrylics. In this we're working light to dark. So it would probably be a good idea for me to actually do a wash of green over the whole thing to start. Maybe we'll do that for the next one. Alright, so I've got a little gap here that I want to get, so I'm going to get some more washy green. If I need to clean paint out of my wells, the best way that I've found to do it is like put a little bit of water in the well and let it sit for like a minute, and then wipe it out with a paper towel. That gets it pretty good. Now for this one, I need to do like a shadow tone. So I'm going to mix some green to start. It's going to be pretty similar to my top starting out. now I want to mix in another color to make it darker and make a shadow. So the color I'm going to choose is going to be the complement to the green. So for my green here, the complementary color is going to be red. So I'm going to add some red. Now, since I'm watercoloring, I want to be careful. Actually, let's wait on that. Since it's wet, potentially. If this is wet, then the color is going to bleed into the next section. I don't want that. So let's actually wait on the shadow there. Let's move on to our next form here. So we're going to do the circle. Make the circle orange. I don't know why, just because. So I'm going to use a slightly different method this time. I'm going to make an orange wash. So I want my orange wash to be pretty light. You might test it somewhere if you've got some spare paper. It's good to have. But I can also pull it off with my paper towel if I need to. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the highlight on this light, at least for now. So I'm going to kind of just paint a border around the highlight. I want to keep probably about there. I'm going to pull my tone away from that. So if I've got a shiny object, I might have a highlight that gets to being white, that it's really reflecting the light. So if I want to do that, that's kind of how I would do it. I want to paint around the highlight. And in order to get a good gradient, I kind of want to just keep adding water to this wash to get it as light as possible. So I'm doing just a wash to start this one out. The reason for that is so I don't have any like gaps, color gaps. You could even go through your whole watercolor and paint everything the local color. So the local color is the color that the object is. Okay, so if this is an orange sphere, then the local color is orange. If this is a green cube, the local color is green. And if I want to transition that further, I might even come in and get an even lighter wash around it. That was a pretty good highlight. Alright, so let's go back. Let me feel. This is pretty dry. If your green square is fairly dry, we can go back to that. So this is good because I let my water sit in my red, so it's thickened up a little bit. So I want to mix some red and some green together. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a desaturated shadow tone. So I probably want more green in there because it's still a green box. But it's going to make it kind of darker, and it's going to make it kind of grayer. So that should give us a pretty good shadow tone for that green area. It's not bleeding, so we're in good shape. So it's always the complementary color that you mix, or usually, or like a near complement will even work usually. So green would go with red, yellow would go with purple, blue would go with orange. I like that. It bled into my orange a little bit. I wasn't very smart about that. That's all right. And then for the orange ball, I might use a little blue. Okay, so I'll add some blue here. It's probably good to start. Add some orange to my blue. Maybe like that a little better. Kind of start adding that in. Oh, this is still wet, but maybe you get the idea. So earlier we defined where all the shadow shapes are, so we can like fill up that shadow shape with our light shadow. And then we can work in and go darker with the blue in the extreme shadow spots. And I can also, in like the non-shadow areas, I can increase the saturation a little bit if I want to, just depending on what I'm painting. I feel like I've got too much pigment on there. I'm going to dab it. It's better. All right, so you're basically going to proceed that way. Work through your whole watercolor here. You can paint the shapes whatever colors you want them to be, but try to maintain your highlights and shadows as you work the watercolor over them. Okay? Does anybody have any questions on that?